Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, the place where every cold case, chilling crime, and unsolved mystery is brought back to life. From vanished persons to twisted betrayals, we dig deep into the unknown to uncover the truth that others left buried. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us which city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far the mystery travels. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a case. Because here, some truths are only heard in the dead quiet. Hercule Poirot and Murder in the Glasshouse. Chapter 1. The Invitation from Everwood. The July sun, unrelenting in its blaze over London's rooftops, glinted off the silver trim of Hercule Poirot's walking stick as he descended the steps of Whitehaven Mansions. His attire, as always, was immaculate: dove grey suit, pearl tie-pin, and a boater hat, angled just so. But even the famed Belgian detective could not deny the discomfort of a prolonged heatwave. "It is not the heat, mon ami," he had told his friend Chief Inspector Japp over tea the previous day, "but the vulgarity with which it arrives. London in summer is not for the delicate temperament." So when the invitation from Lady Eleanor Blaithwaite arrived that morning, Poirot took it as a sign from the heavens, albeit delivered via cream-coloured stationery embossed with green vines and the faint perfume of jasmine. "Monsieur Poirot, you are warmly invited to Everwood, our family estate on the Isle of Wight, for a private gathering. My husband, Sir Cedric, intends to unveil his latest botanical hybrid in a setting most agreeable to refined company. I hope the sea air and the quiet gardens will offer you both comfort and curiosity. With fond hope, Lady Eleanor Blaithwaite." It was signed in a looping, elegant hand, the ink slightly faded as if written with hesitation or weariness. Poirot, ever curious and partial to orchids, both in their beauty and in the personality of those who grew them, accepted with a flourish of his own pen. Within 2 days, he found himself alighting from the ferry at Ryde, stepping into a world cooler, greener, and far more enigmatic. A waiting car, vintage and well-kept, bore him through winding lanes lined with ancient oaks until the gates of Everwood Estate appeared. Iron-wrought and adorned with curling vines, they parted slowly to reveal an expansive garden where order danced delicately with wilderness. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as the manor house came into view, stone-fronted, ivy-clad, and dignified in a way only houses with generations of history can be. Poirot was greeted at the main entrance by Hammond, the Blaithwaite's valet. Thin as a sapling and twice as stiff, the man offered a precise bow. "Welcome to Everwood, monsieur. Lady Eleanor awaits you in the south drawing-room." The drawing-room, panelled in dark walnut and heavy with the scent of lavender polish, overlooked a gently sloping lawn where a glasshouse shimmered in the afternoon light. Lady Eleanor rose from her armchair as Poirot entered. She was tall, her figure elegant, despite the black crepe she wore. Her hair was silvered at the temples, drawn back in a style that spoke more of duty than fashion. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, "thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "You make the invitation sound almost like a summons, madame," he replied with a smile, "and one does not decline a summons to beauty." Her expression twitched, whether in amusement or sadness, Poirot could not say. "It is my husband who has drawn you here, truly," she said, gesturing toward the lawn. "The orchid. He calls it Phalaenopsis eleonara, after me, though I suspect it's less tribute than torment. But perhaps you'll understand when you meet him." Sir Cedric Blaithwaite, as Poirot would soon discover, was a man of precision and pride, both sharpened by solitude. Once a celebrated botanist and explorer, he had retreated to Everwood a decade prior, turning his talents to hybrid orchids, for which he had earned minor fame and considerable fortune. That evening, the guests assembled for supper in a vaulted dining hall filled with botanical sketches framed along the walls. Poirot observed them closely, an old habit, and one that often proved invaluable. There was Cecilia Blaithwaite, Sir Cedric's niece, elegant, ambitious, and discontented. She wore her inheritance in her posture, but her smile never reached her eyes. Beside her sat Dr. Lionel Graves, Sir Cedric's protégé. Young, sharp-featured and soft-spoken, he carried himself with the nervous energy of a man either deeply loyal or painfully compromised. At the other end, Rufus Milburn, a solicitor of the old school, polished his spectacles as he examined the fish course. Every word he spoke was measured, and yet there was a wary alertness about him. But it was the youngest guest who intrigued Poirot most, Ivy Ray, introduced as the daughter of the head gardener. She was no more than 23, her features delicate and sun-kissed, her hands calloused. Yet her eyes watched everyone, especially Sir Cedric, with a strange, thoughtful intensity. Sir Cedric, when he finally entered, was a presence unto himself. Tall, with a hawk-like profile, his clothes hung from his frame, as if he had little patience for tailoring. His voice, when he spoke, was commanding but not loud. Every sentence sounded like a pronouncement. "I see we are all here," he said, glancing around the table with something bordering on disdain. "Tomorrow morning at precisely 10, the orchid will be revealed. You may judge then whether I have succeeded or failed. But tonight," he paused, lifting a glass, "we drink to potential." The toast was received with polite applause. Poirot, sipping only lightly from his wine, noted the reactions. Eleanor's eyes stayed on her husband, but said nothing. Cecilia's hand trembled slightly on her fork. Graves looked down, biting his lip, and Ivy Ray didn't toast at all. After supper, Poirot strolled the grounds, enjoying the sea breeze and the hush that comes only to places steeped in secrets. From the path, he could see the great glass house, its panes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Inside, the shape of the orchid loomed like a strange sentinel, its petals full, heavy, waiting. He thought of Sir Cedric's words, "You may judge then whether I have succeeded or failed." Poirot stopped, adjusted his cuffs and whispered to himself, "It is not only the flower that is being unveiled tomorrow. No, I think perhaps something else altogether shall bloom." And with that, he turned back toward the manor, where within 24 hours, murder would make itself known. At precisely 10 o'clock, as instructed, the company made their way along the gravel path to the glass house. The structure itself was an impressive feat of Edwardian design, iron-framed long as a train carriage and lined with panes so clean they mirrored the garden. Inside it held a curated jungle, orchids in every shade of cream and blush, vines draping with casual elegance, and a scent that was somehow both intoxicating and aloof. Chapter 2. A Death Among Petals. The following morning dawned in a misted hush, the sort of pale velvet air one expects on an island edged by sea and secrets. The lawn of Everwood lay cool and undisturbed beneath a white veil of dew, while the glass house, Sir Cedric Blaithwaite's crown jewel, glimmered softly as the sun strained to pierce the low clouds. Poirot rose early, as was his habit, and dressed with his usual care. Though his moustache was already impeccable, he took a final moment to perfect it, examining the symmetry with a small pocket mirror before stepping into the corridor. Downstairs, the house stirred with cautious energy. The guests gathered gradually over breakfast, tea and soft-boiled eggs served with the hush of restrained conversation. Sir Cedric had not yet appeared. A small note, pinned near the garden door, written in his unmistakable hand, read simply, "The unveiling at 10. Please enter through the west doors only." At the centre, beneath a domed lantern roof, stood a raised platform with a linen-draped stand. The orchid, Phalaenopsis eleonara, had not yet been revealed. Lady Eleanor, composed and silent, stood to the left. Beside her, Cecilia Blaithwaite held a parasol, the handle gripped a shade too tightly. Dr. Graves loitered near the misting pipes, his eyes fixed on a notepad. Ivy Ray remained quiet, her gaze locked on the sheet that veiled the bloom. Rufus Milburn, ever dignified, hovered near the door with the detachment of a man assessing liabilities. Poirot took his place beside a bronze urn of bromeliads. He watched, listened, observed. Sir Cedric, however, did not come. Minutes passed. A few uneasy glances were exchanged. Eleanor stepped forward and cleared her throat delicately. Perhaps he is delayed. The glass house is vast. He may be in the rear greenhouse preparing the atmosphere. Cedric is particular about humidity. Or perhaps he's decided to surprise us dramatically, Cecilia added, though her voice lacked conviction. Poirot frowned. Pardon me, mesdames, I believe it is unlike Sir Cedric to be tardy for his own triumph. Without waiting, he moved gently past the others, following the length of the orchid beds toward the private section of the structure, a rear annex enclosed by frosted panels. He paused. Something in the air felt stagnant. Not death, but the absence of life. He knocked once on the side door. Monsieur Blaithwaite, c'est moi, Poirot. No response. He pressed gently. The door gave way with a slight creak. Inside, the temperature was sweltering. The misting system had recently been activated. Beads of moisture clung to the leaves like sweat. And there, amid the rows of prized orchids and half-labelled petri dishes, lay Sir Cedric Blaithwaite, crumpled beside the pedestal meant for his orchid. One hand reached up toward the plant, the other gripped a glass flask now empty. Poirot knelt carefully. No pulse. The body had cooled slightly, but not long enough to rule out early morning. A single yellow smudge, pollen perhaps, rested along Cedric's collarbone. The orchid, once hidden, was now in full view. Large, waxy petals of marbled white and crimson, its centre a bright yellow throat. Stunning, and yet oddly sinister in its symmetry. Poirot stood and called out, "Do not enter, please. I must ask you all to remain where you are." Inspector Kelvin, a stout, weather-tanned local from Newport, arrived within the hour. He moved briskly, but with visible skepticism. Heart failure, most likely, glasshouse conditions, his age, and these heat spells. Seen it before. Mais non, Poirot replied gently. There are things here that do not sit in harmony. Kelvin gave him a bemused glance. Go on then. Poirot pointed to the orchid's placement. It was not unveiled. Yet the sheet was removed. Why? Maybe he did it himself before collapsing. Then we must ask, Poirot said, why the linen is folded neatly on the floor, not crumpled or clutched. And look, his gloves are in his pocket. Sir Cedric was meticulous. He would never handle the final bloom with bare hands, especially not one laced with such concentrated pollen. You think the orchid killed him? Kelvin laughed. Poisonous plant stories make good theatre, but I'll need more than conjecture. Poirot smiled faintly. I do not yet propose a solution, Inspector, merely that the method warrants attention. He did not collapse haphazardly. His posture suggests he fell from standing, not sitting. And see, his spectacles are 5 feet away by the misting pipe. Kelvin grunted. Perhaps he staggered. Or perhaps, Poirot murmured, he was made to stagger. Lady Eleanor, brought in once the room was cleared, stood by the doorway without stepping inside. She did not weep. Instead, she whispered, he always said that orchids never forgive neglect. Perhaps one took it personally. Poirot gently took her arm. Madame, forgive me, but I believe your husband did not fall victim to chance. Someone orchestrated his death, and I fear this orchid, beautiful though it may be, is the instrument of a carefully cultivated murder. As they walked back toward the house, Poirot glanced once more at the bloom behind the glass. It stood tall, wide open, proud, and entirely silent. But in its silence, Poirot could already hear whispers. Chapter 3. The Secret Life of Orchids. The rain arrived in the early afternoon, light at first, then steadily persistent, as if the skies themselves were reluctant to leave Everwood untouched by grief. The garden, once so precise and picturesque, now bore a look of cautious retreat. The glass house stood dark and silent, its latticed panes slick with water, like a creature that had briefly stirred and now slumbered again. Inside the manor, the air had changed. The drawing room, though warmed by a small fire, felt cool with tension. Conversation was hushed, glances were careful. Poirot sat by the hearth, tapping one polished shoe lightly against the brass grate. Inspector Kelvin had departed, promising to send a coroner from Newport, though with the firm opinion that natural causes would prevail. Poirot had made no argument. He had simply said, "We shall see what nature reveals." Now, with the household gathered and the storm keeping all indoors, Poirot began his work. He first called upon Dr. Lionel Graves, who entered the study with the hesitant step of one accustomed to observation but unused to scrutiny. "You worked closely with Sir Cedric?" Poirot asked, motioning for the young man to sit. "Yes," Lionel replied, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "For nearly 5 years, I assisted with hybridization trials, temperature controls, nutrient balances. He was a demanding teacher." "And this particular orchid, the Phalaenopsis eleonara, was it discussed openly?" "Not really. He kept much of the process private these past months, locked the lab, recorded notes in cipher. He'd say things like, 'They'll never understand what I've created,' or 'Some blooms aren't meant for every eye.'" Poirot steepled his fingers. "That is interesting. Tell me, did he ever speak of danger associated with this flower?" Lionel blinked. "Danger? No, I don't think so, though, to be fair. The genus does include species with mild toxicity, but nothing fatal unless ingested in large quantities." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And you were where this morning? At the time of discovery?" "In the solarium, reviewing a cross-pollination chart. Lady Eleanor passed by. I'm sure she can confirm." "I shall ask," Poirot said pleasantly. "Merci, Dr. Graves." Next, Poirot took a short walk down the west corridor to a side parlour where Ivy Ray sat quietly with a cup of tea untouched on the table before her. Rain tapped lightly against the windows as she looked up. "You are very composed, mademoiselle," Poirot remarked. "Most young people would be rattled by death, especially one so close." "I've seen death before," she said plainly. "My father was injured in a quarry accident. I was 14. There wasn't much dignity in it." Poirot studied her with renewed interest. "You were fond of Sir Cedric?" "He was kind in his way. Short-tempered, but not cruel to me. He said I had a natural touch with orchids, that I understood their silences." Poirot sat opposite. "And what do you understand about this orchid, the Eleonara?" She looked at him for a long moment before replying. It frightened him. He wouldn't admit it, but he was afraid of what he'd made. Because it was toxic. Because it reminded him of something, or someone. Her voice dropped. "I think it was named after Lady Eleanor, but it had the face of someone else." Poirot's brow arched. "And who might that be?" "I don't know, but I once found a sketch he'd torn up. A woman's face, younger than Lady Eleanor, darker hair. He'd drawn it over and over." Poirot leaned back, absorbing her words. "And you did not think to ask who she was?" "I did." Ivy's tone cooled. He said, "Never resurrect the roots you didn't plant. I took that as a warning." Poirot left her with a gentle nod. "Mademoiselle, you are more observant than most. Do not bury that gift." Back in the main hall, Poirot encountered Rufus Milburn, the family solicitor. The man was perusing an oil portrait of a previous Blaithwaite patriarch with an air of bored detachment. "You must be busy today," Poirot said lightly. "With wills to consider, perhaps." Milburn gave a tight smile. "A solicitor is always prepared for death, Mr. Poirot. But in this case, I expect the family will need patience. Sir Cedric drafted a revised testament only days ago. I saw it with my own eyes." "Ah, and may I ask whom did it favour?" The solicitor's expression flickered. "As of the new draft, the majority of the estate was to pass to a single heir. And that heir was— "I regret to say the document is missing," Milburn said, not quite meeting Poirot's gaze. "It was stored in the study safe, but when Lady Eleanor and I checked this morning, it was gone." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is most inconvenient. Indeed, the previous will, of course, leaves everything to Cecilia Blaithwaite, with minor bequests to staff. Without the new one, that is what stands." Poirot tapped his cane once on the floor. "And the loss of the new will was the safe forced?" Number opened with a key. Poirot gave a small, slow nod. "Then we must wonder who had access to that key." Later that day, Poirot took a solitary stroll under the protection of an umbrella, past the perimeter gardens, and into the wooded section of the estate. A small footpath, barely visible beneath the leaf mulch, led to a secluded cottage. It was locked, but a glance through the window revealed a second, smaller greenhouse behind it, less ornate, more functional. Inside, he could just make out shelves of botanical jars, a set of surgical gloves, and a chart pinned to the wall. On the ground, near the side gate, lay a torn corner of fabric, soaked but recognizable, a piece of gardening glove. Poirot returned to the Manor with a mind both sharpened and unsettled. In the drawing room, the fire had dwindled, and Lady Eleanor sat alone by the window. "May I ask you one thing, madame?" Poirot said softly. "Was your husband a man of sentiment?" She gave a faint smile. "No, Monsieur Poirot. Cedric was a man of memory, but sentiment? Never. He preferred plants to people." Poirot looked out toward the rain-blurred garden, where the glass house loomed like a mausoleum. "Then I wonder, Lady Eleanor, what exactly did he remember when he bred that flower, and who else shared in its memory?" Chapter 4. The Woman in the Photograph. Rain had fallen through the night and softened into a quiet drizzle by morning, laying a wet hush across the grounds of Everwood. A faint mist lingered in the hollows near the glasshouse, as if nature itself were reluctant to disturb the scene of Sir Cedric's death. The petals of the Phalaenopsis Eleonara, still on display, now glistened with dew like frozen tears. Poirot rose early, as was his custom, and made for the study, where Lady Eleanor had permitted him access to her late husband's private papers. The room smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and dried rose petals, a curious blend of the masculine and the mourned. A single oil lamp burned on the desk, casting long shadows against the walls lined with botanical journals and expedition maps. Poirot moved slowly, methodically. He did not rummage, he revealed. A locked drawer in the center desk proved to yield after a few gentle tugs and the application of a thin hairpin. Inside, tucked between a leather notebook and an empty envelope, lay a photograph. The picture, though faded, was striking. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, stared back at the camera with a quiet kind of sadness. Her features bore no resemblance to Lady Eleanor. Her hair was dark, her mouth softer, her eyes too large for her face. She wore a pale blouse and stood beside a greenhouse nearly identical to the one at Everwood. Poirot turned the photograph over. Written in a looping hand was a single name. Marguerite, August 1917. Beside it, in different ink, the initials IR had been added, perhaps years later. A sharp knock interrupted him. It was Miss Cecilia Blaithwaite, her expression brisk, her auburn hair pinned up with clinical neatness. "I was told you were in the study," she said. "I thought you should know Inspector Kelvin has returned. He insists the coroner's preliminary report points to natural causes, heart failure exacerbated by heat and age." Poirot smiled faintly. "That would be convenient, would it not, mademoiselle?" "I beg your pardon." "For someone who stands to inherit a considerable estate," he said, slipping the photograph into his coat pocket. "Convenience is a kind of silence." Cecilia flushed. "I've done nothing wrong, Mr. Poirot." "Of course not, but you have done very little that is right either." She turned sharply on her heel and left. Later, Poirot found himself drawn to the cottage at the far end of the estate once more. The rear greenhouse, which had intrigued him the day before, now stood unlocked. Inside, rows of neglected plants lined wooden shelves, but one section had clearly been used recently. On the potting bench, he discovered a torn sheet of paper beneath a notebook. It was a list handwritten in Cedric's spidery scrawl. Foul, Marguerite equals Eleonora minus R, second stage hybridized. Hidden, memory preserved, destroy, duplicate. Beside the note sat a discarded bottle, labelled in Latin. Epicarius rufus extractum, a rare orchid-derived compound known in certain horticultural circles for its sedative properties. Poirot turned slowly, deep in thought. Cedric had preserved a memory through his flower, but for whom? As he returned to the manor, the hallway echoed with raised voices. At the far end, Rufus Milburn, the family solicitor, was in heated discussion with Lady Eleanor. Poirot remained still, listening with the polite impoliteness of a detective. He destroyed the first will. The new one exists only by witness. You said yourself it was signed in the library. If the original cannot be produced, Lady Eleanor's voice, though calm, sliced through. You may dispense with the legal lecture, Mr. Milburn. I asked you here to handle my husband's affairs with dignity, not to argue over signatures and footnotes. Milburn turned, startled by Poirot's quiet presence. You see what I mean, sir? We are left with nothing concrete. Nothing, Poirot said mildly. On the contrary, monsieur. We have an orchid, a photograph, and a forgotten greenhouse. These are not nothing. They are the bones of memory. Milburn frowned. I'm not sure I follow. No, Poirot murmured, but you will. That evening, with the rain finally subsiding, Poirot requested a private conversation with Ivy Ray. She agreed, though her eyes were wary. They met in the conservatory where the sound of dripping water and the scent of damp soil offered a kind of strange sanctuary. Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, have you ever seen this photograph before? He held it out. Ivy's breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. Yes, she whispered. I found it once. He caught me looking. He tore it up and burned the pieces. I didn't know there was another. Who is she? I don't know her name, but I think she was my mother. Poirot's voice softened. You suspect that you are not the gardener's daughter. I know I'm not, Ivy said. I found a birth certificate years ago. No name for father. The certificate was issued in Marseille. The gardener, Walter, he raised me like his own, but I always knew. He worked here when I was small. When Sir Cedric returned from abroad, he asked Walter to bring me back. I thought it was a kindness. Later I realized it was guilt. Poirot regarded her solemnly. And this orchid, this Eleonora, it was named for Lady Eleanor, oui, but modelled after Marguerite, your mother. I think he loved her once, Ivy said quietly. And I think Lady Eleanor knew. Poirot stood slowly. Then we must ask, who hated that flower most, the man who created it, or the woman it dishonoured? Outside, the clouds had broken. The last rays of sunlight caught the dome of the glass house, setting the panes ablaze with gold. Poirot looked toward it and said softly, In the heart of the flower, mademoiselle, there lies not beauty, but motive. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Heir. The dawn came late and reluctantly, as though the sky itself felt some measure of the house's unease. Everwood lay half submerged in morning fog, the trees mere silhouettes, and the manicured lawns blurred at the edges. Inside the manor, the mood was subdued, save for the low rustle of breakfast trays and the occasional creak of the hallway floorboards. Hercule Poirot stood at the window of the east sitting-room, a cup of weak tea in his hand, which he had not touched. His gaze was fixed on the farthest end of the garden, on the narrow path that led to the gardener's cottage, and beyond that, the second, secret greenhouse. He did not speak, not even to himself. But within, his little grey cells were alive with movement. He turned sharply as a footfall sounded behind him. It was Lady Eleanor, dressed in muted lavender, her eyes shadowed but steady. "I was told you've been walking the grounds at odd hours," she said. "Oui, madame," Poirot replied. The ground, like the conscience, often reveals the hidden when disturbed. She smiled faintly. "Do you believe Cedric was murdered?" "I do not believe," Poirot said. "I conclude. And I have concluded. Yes." She came closer, her tone calm but clipped. "Then I hope you'll be careful. Cedric was not well liked, but that does not mean he was worth killing." Poirot studied her. "Forgive me, Lady Eleanor, but that is the language of someone accustomed to cleaning up after damage, not preventing it." She flinched, almost imperceptibly. "He was my husband." "Was he ever your partner?" A pause. "He was my obligation." With that, she left, her footsteps echoing down the stone-floored corridor. Poirot turned and took from his pocket the photograph of Marguerite. He laid it beside the crumpled list he'd found in the greenhouse. Fal. Marguerite equals Eleonora-R, second stage. What was the second stage? What memory had Cedric tried to preserve and then, perhaps, destroy? Later that morning, Poirot requested a formal interview with Cecilia Blaithwaite. She received him in the blue parlour, seated in an upright chair that made her look more sculpted than alive. "I have no objection to your inquiries, Mr. Poirot," she said, "but I would ask that you be mindful of the family's reputation." "It is precisely the family's history that concerns me," Poirot said smoothly. "Mademoiselle, what do you know of Ivy Ray's parentage?" Her expression barely changed. "Ivy is the gardener's daughter." "Come now," Poirot said gently. "You are an intelligent woman. Surely you've noticed the resemblance, those eyes, that brow, the shape of the mouth." "She's very pretty, if that's what you're suggesting," Cecilia replied coldly, "and far more observant than one would expect for someone raised among soil." Poirot smiled. "You resent her." "No," she said, her tone brittle. "I resent what she represents." "And what is that?" Cecilia stood abruptly. "That Cedric, who neglected me since childhood, should in his final act choose to give everything to a stranger, a servant's child, while I watched him speak of legacy and lineage as though neither applied to me." Poirot looked up at her. "And did he tell you he was changing his will?" She hesitated. "Yes. A week ago. He said I would understand in time. But I already knew what he meant." Poirot stood as well. "And where were you the morning he died?" "In my room, with the door locked. You may ask any of the maids." Poirot bowed slightly. "I do not doubt you, mademoiselle, but the orchid, it requires no brute force, only access and patience." She paled but said nothing more. That afternoon, Poirot walked to the gardener's cottage. Inside, he found Ivy Ray, hands deep in soil, transplanting a bruised orchid into a new pot. "Why do you do this?" he asked. "They'll die otherwise," she said simply. Poirot watched her gently loosen the roots. "Miss Ray, did you know Sir Cedric had named you as his heir?" She froze. "No." "There was a revised will," Poirot said. "It is missing now, but several people saw it. The entire estate, Everwood, the archives, the orchid patents, was to be yours." Ivy sat back, her hands trembling. "But why?" "Because he loved your mother, and because you, perhaps unknowingly, were the only thing he left of her." Tears filled her eyes. "He never said." "No," Poirot said softly. "He bred a flower instead." She looked up at him, pale. "You think that's why he was killed?" "I think," Poirot said, "that someone feared your legitimacy more than his affection." At that moment, Hammond, the valet, appeared at the door. "Pardon, sir, but you may wish to see this." In his hand he held a folded sheet of parchment, damp but intact. It was the missing will. Poirot opened it carefully. Sir Cedric's signature, bold and defiant, stood above a line of text that began, "I hereby bequeath all property, intellectual and material, to Ivy Ray. Poirot handed it back, eyes narrowed. "Where did you find this?" "Beneath the loose floorboard in Sir Cedric's private greenhouse," Hammond said. "I was tending to the mist pipes and noticed something warped." Poirot stared at him. "And why, may I ask, were you tending to pipes in a greenhouse he hadn't used in weeks?" Hammond hesitated. "Habit, sir. The orchids require vigilance." Poirot said nothing. But in his mind, the mist shifted. Someone had tried to hide a legacy. Someone had removed a truth. But as with all things living, roots grow deep. Chapter 6. The Poisoned Bloom. The storm had passed, but the atmosphere at Everwood remained thick, no longer with rain, but with the scent of unearthed secrets. Even the air within the glass house, usually warm with living fragrance, felt stifled, as though the very plants sensed something unnatural among them. Hercule Poirot returned to the scene of the death with purpose that morning. A gardener named Rowley unlocked the doors for him, tipped his cap, and retreated without a word. Poirot stood alone amongst the orchids, a single figure amid rows of unnatural beauty. The Phalaenopsis Eleonara remained untouched on its pedestal. Poirot observed it silently. Its delicate white petals, marked with veins of deep crimson, were almost too precise. There was something theatrical about it, something staged. He removed a small notebook from his coat and turned to a diagram he had drawn the night before of the misting system's pipework and the timing levers beneath the glasshouse floor. With gloved fingers, Poirot crouched beside the mist controller. The settings were marked clearly: humidity, temperature, release intervals. He noted the last set time, 5:45 a.m., Poirot murmured to himself. He died between 6 and 7, alone, but the system was prepared hours earlier. He traced the pipework backwards and located a small feed valve. Attached to it, nearly hidden beneath a potted fern, was a cloth-wrapped bottle. It had no label. Poirot's brow furrowed. Returning to the manor, Poirot sought out Dr. Lionel Graves, who was in the solarium trimming bonsai branches with unnecessary force. "Dr. Graves," Poirot said, "you are a man of science. May I trouble you for a simple test?" Graves looked up warily. "Of course." Poirot handed him the bottle. "Analyze this, s'il vous plaît, quickly." The young man opened it cautiously and took a whiff. It's botanical, definitely orchid-based, but it's concentrated, almost weaponized. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Can it kill?" Graves hesitated. "Under the right conditions, yes. If atomized and inhaled, it could paralyze the lungs within minutes." Poirot nodded gravely. Then Sir Cedric did not simply collapse. He was poisoned, and not with a chemical foreign to this estate, but by his own obsession. Graves swallowed hard. "But who would do that? Who would even know how?" Poirot regarded him a moment. "Someone who understood both the system and the man." Later that day, Poirot asked the household to gather in the drawing room, a request met with stiff compliance. Lady Eleanor sat nearest the hearth, hands folded like ivory. Cecilia stood near the window, chin high. Lionel Graves lingered by the piano, restless. Ivy Ray sat slightly apart, knees drawn in as if bracing for a storm. Rufus Milburn arrived last, still wiping rain from his sleeves. Poirot stood before them all. "You are wondering why I've gathered you. It is because, mes amis, the death of Sir Cedric was no accident. It was a murder, calm, calculated and botanical in design." A gasp escaped Cecilia. Ivy went pale. Poirot raised a hand. "Permit me to explain. The glasshouse misting system was sabotaged, primed to release a botanical compound at dawn. The very orchid Sir Cedric unveiled, bred over years of secrecy, was laced with a paralytic agent. Its vapor, combined with the humidity, became lethal. The killer knew the plant's nature. More importantly, they knew his nature, his routines, his pride, his insistence on inspecting it alone." Lady Eleanor spoke quietly. "And who, Mr. Poirot, do you believe had such knowledge?" Poirot turned to her, his eyes sharp. "The answer begins with the will." He drew the recovered parchment from his coat. Sir Cedric intended to leave his estate to Ivy Ray, but the document was hidden, stuffed beneath floorboards in a building only one person had reason to enter. He turned slowly to Hammond, the valet. "You have been in Sir Cedric's employ for how long?" 22 years, Hammond replied, his voice neutral. "And you were once more than a valet, were you not?" "I made inquiries. Before the war you trained as a chemist in Zurich. Your credentials were revoked following a scandal involving controlled substances. You disappeared until you reappeared as a man of service." Hammond's expression hardened. "You've done your homework, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot gave a short bow. "Always. And I noticed something curious. You were present the morning Cedric died. You fetched the tools, unlocked the rear greenhouse, and yet you claimed to find the will later, by chance." "You're mistaken." "Am I? Then how do you explain the gloves? Your gloves, torn and soaked with a chemical residue matching the compound in this bottle?" He held up the flask Lionel had analysed. "Sir Cedric's death was not just about legacy," Poirot continued. "It was about revenge." Ivy Ray stood suddenly. "Revenge? But why? What did he do?" Poirot turned to her gently. "Your mother, Marguerite, was not merely a memory for Cedric. She was a secret, one he paid for with shame and silence." He faced Hammond once more. "Marguerite was your sister, wasn't she?" A long pause. Hammond's eyes darkened. "She was," he said softly. "And he discarded her, used her, then hid her away like a blot on his name. I found her in Marseille, dying. Her last words were of a man who had promised her love and left her alone." Poirot nodded. "And so you waited. You entered his home, served his meals, prepared his clothes, all the while watching, planning, until he made his fatal mistake, bringing her daughter here, giving her the name, the flower, the fortune. And that, monsieur, you could not allow." There was no denial, only silence. Poirot approached him. "You could have exposed him, but you wanted more. You wanted him to die by his own hand, a flower grown in his name, designed to destroy." Inspector Kelvin, who had been summoned in secret, stepped forward from the adjoining room. "Hammond Graves," he said, "I'll need you to come with me." The valet, now stripped of his mask, offered no resistance. As he was led away, Poirot turned back to the others. "It is a strange thing," he said quietly, "how a man may nurture beauty to forget his guilt. But guilt, mes amis, grows like a root. It pushes up through the soil, no matter how carefully buried." Chapter 7. The Glasshouse Trap. It was a curious thing, Poirot reflected, how the solving of a murder rarely produced the calm that the newspapers promised. The staff at Everwood now moved in stilted silence, as though afraid of disturbing whatever lay beneath the surface of restored order. Conversations paused when footsteps approached. Teacups clinked more carefully. And yet Poirot was not satisfied. Hammond had confessed to murder. His motive was plausible. His means were proven. And yet to Poirot's eye, the pieces, though snug, did not quite click. Something still remained out of alignment. That morning, Poirot requested one final visit to the private greenhouse. Ivy Ray, who now carried the strange weight of inheritance, offered to accompany him. They walked the stone path side by side, her hands tucked into the pockets of her raincoat. "You don't believe him, do you?" she said softly. "Let us say," Poirot replied, "that Monsieur Hammond gave us a story full of facts, but not the truth." Inside the greenhouse, the air was cooler now, the heaters shut down. The plants had been moved, the platform stripped. Yet Poirot's eyes travelled to the misting system, the timer dial, the soil beneath the pedestal. He crouched, pulling a pair of tweezers from his pocket. "What is it?" Ivy asked. Poirot retrieved a small metal ring, broken at one edge, no wider than a coin. "A gear," he said. "From the automatic timer, recently replaced, see, newer metal. That suggests someone tampered with the mechanism more than once." Ivy frowned. Why would Hammond replace the timer? He already knew how to deliver the poison. Just so, Poirot said, standing slowly. Then perhaps Hammond was not the one who tampered with it first. They left the greenhouse and returned to the manor. Poirot made no declaration, no announcement. Instead, he retreated to the study and wrote a series of short notes. By the evening, 4 guests found crisp envelopes on their pillows, each requesting their presence at the Glasshouse at 8 o'clock sharp. The sun had set behind a veil of lilac clouds when they arrived. Lady Eleanor, veiled and poised, with her hands encased in kid gloves. Cecilia Blaithwaite, tense, her lips set in a firm, expectant line. Dr. Lionel Graves, cautious, keeping his distance. And Ivy Ray, steady but uncertain. Poirot stood before them with a soft smile. "Forgive the drama," he said, "but the hour has come to resolve what remains buried." He gestured toward the pedestal. "The orchid is gone, but its shadow remains. A man died here. Another confessed. But one thing was never explained. Why kill then? Why not before? The flower was weeks away from publication, the will freshly written, yet Sir Cedric chose that precise moment to unveil all. Why? Cecilia answered first. Because he was arrogant. He always waited until the moment of greatest impact. Poirot nodded, and because perhaps he had only just realized what the orchid truly was. He turned. "Dr. Graves, you altered Cedric's botanical journals. Why?" Graves paled. "I wanted credit. He never acknowledged my work. I thought if I left my version in the records, I'd be remembered." Poirot stepped forward. "But you also knew the flower had dangerous properties." "Yes, but I didn't poison it," Graves cried. "I warned him it could be reactive under certain heat thresholds. He dismissed me, said toxicity was part of the expression." Poirot's gaze settled on Lady Eleanor. "Madame, when did you first suspect that the flower was not named for you at all?" Her expression remained still. "He told me the name was Eleonora. That was enough." "But you are not a woman easily deceived," Poirot said gently. "You found the photograph, you saw the sketches, you recognized Marguerite." Lady Eleanor gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I did. I confronted him. He said she was a phase, a mistake. But I saw the way he looked at Ivy. Not like a gardener's girl. Like a ghost he couldn't bury." Poirot said nothing. Instead, he walked to the pedestal and retrieved a small cloth bundle. From it, he withdrew a second bottle, one identical to the compound Lionel had analyzed. "I discovered this beneath the library floorboards, hidden beneath the original botanical drawer. Not by Hammond, by someone who knew the house better, someone with access to the keys, someone who would do anything to keep the past quiet." He looked at Cecilia Blaithwaite. "Shall I tell them about the lab tests, mademoiselle? The handwriting on the list of hybrid properties was yours. The missing gear in the misting system, it matched the one in your music box, which is now broken. You tampered with the timing, twice, the first time to frighten him, the second to kill." Cecilia's face crumpled, but not with tears, with fury. "He was going to give everything to her, a girl from nowhere. He never even looked at me, not really. I was just there. An obligation, a name, not even blood." Lady Eleanor spoke then, low and controlled. "You could have told me. And you would have said what?" Cecilia turned on her. "That he was allowed to replace me? That I was the intruder? You stayed silent while he gave everything away. So I gave him a legacy he couldn't pass on." Poirot's voice was quiet now. "You planned the murder, but you didn't count on Hammond. He discovered what you'd done and took the blame for his sister. Perhaps out of shame, perhaps to punish the Blaithwaites in his own way." Cecilia looked at him, her mask gone. "He was willing to kill, so was I. We were just 2 roots growing in the same poisoned soil." Poirot signalled to Inspector Kelvin, who stepped forward once more from the shadows. "It is over, mademoiselle." Poirot said softly. The garden will survive, but you will not inherit it. Chapter 8. The Hand That Planted Death. The following morning dawned golden and still, as though the island itself had drawn a breath and released it at last. At Everwood, the glasshouse stood silent, its iron bones casting long shadows across the dew-silvered lawn. Within, the orchids drooped slightly, no longer tended, their petals too delicate to understand that the man who nurtured them would never return. Inside the manor, Hercule Poirot took breakfast alone in the south-facing parlour. Toast with orange marmalade, one soft-boiled egg, and coffee, always black, always precisely hot. He stirred it gently, then turned toward the window where the sea glimmered faintly through the trees. Lady Eleanor entered quietly, dressed in mourning grey. She did not speak immediately, nor did Poirot rise. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from him. "You have not asked," he said at last, "but I imagine you want to know what will become of her." "Cecilia?" He nodded. Lady Eleanor smoothed her gloves. "I suppose I already know the law is clear." Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, tampering with evidence, conspiracy, premeditation. She will not escape justice, though her sentence may be tempered by youth and remorse." "She loved him in a twisted way," Lady Eleanor said quietly. "Even in her resentment, that makes it worse." "She loved what she believed she deserved," Poirot replied. "It is not the same as love freely given." They sat in silence a moment. "I always knew about Marguerite," she said suddenly. "Not her name, but her presence. Cedric would walk differently when he passed the south corridor where her picture was once kept. He flinched at perfume, refused to listen to Debussy. She lived in all the places he avoided." Poirot's eyes softened. "And Ivy?" Lady Eleanor sighed. "I suspected. Her eyes were too much like his. But she had none of his cruelty, only his quiet. I believe she will make a fine mistress of Everwood," Poirot said gently, "if she chooses to stay." At that moment, Ivy Ray herself entered, the inheritance fresh upon her shoulders, like a garment not yet tailored. She looked out of place, yet grounded, like a wildflower growing between stone walls. "I wanted to thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, "not just for the truth, but for giving it gently." "I merely revealed what already existed, mademoiselle," he replied. "You were always the root, the rest was foliage." She gave a small smile. "I've decided not to keep it all." "Oh?" "I'll turn the estate into a botanical conservatory, a place for healing and research. And I'll fund a scholarship in Marguerite's name for girls like me who came from silence." Poirot stood. "Then you are more than heiress, mademoiselle. You are gardener of legacy." As Ivy left the room, Poirot turned to the window once more. The morning light had reached the far end of the garden, illuminating the now empty pedestal in the glasshouse. "Will you go?" Lady Eleanor asked softly. Poirot straightened his cuffs. "Yes, the truth has been unearthed, and the garden no longer hides its thorns." He took his hat, his walking stick, and offered Lady Eleanor one last bow. "You must be tired," she said. "Of murder, of loss." Poirot smiled faintly. "Madame, one never tires of truth, only of how slowly it blooms." He stepped out onto the gravel path, where the last of the summer's breeze stirred the leaves gently. The garden, though wounded, would recover. The soil would settle. And somewhere, in a corner of the glass house, a new orchid would bloom, unremarkable perhaps in appearance, but rooted in something far stronger than pride. It would be named Phalaenopsis Marguerite, and it would survive. Epilogue. 2 months had passed since the death at Everwood. The headlines had faded from the broadsheets, replaced by newer scandals, fresher tragedies. The case of the poisoned orchid was now the subject of whispers in horticultural societies and the occasional sideways reference in legal circles. But for those who had walked through that glass house, who had smelled the sweet, silent breath of the flower that killed, it remained vividly rooted in memory. Poirot had returned to London, to his flat in Whitehaven Mansions, where everything was precisely where he had left it. His slippers warmed by the radiator, his moustache scissors neatly aligned on the vanity, and a small parcel waiting on the hall table. It had come by post, wrapped in thick cream paper, tied with twine. He opened it slowly. Inside, nestled between sheets of pressed parchment, lay a single orchid, delicate, unassuming, with ivory petals tinged faintly with lavender. Not the infamous Eleonora, nor its poisonous kin. Something gentler, something new. There was no note, just a small card bearing 2 words in careful ink. For Marguerite. Poirot smiled. Ivy Ray had made her decision then. Not just about the estate or the garden, but about the kind of legacy she wished to carry. The greenhouse would reopen in spring as a conservatory, yes, but also as a memorial, to survival, to justice, and to those who had bloomed in silence. He placed the orchid in a glass bowl beside the window, where it would catch the light each morning. It is the strange thing about truth, Poirot thought. It grows slowly, often hidden beneath thick soil, but once uncovered it does not wither, it blossoms,